Well, that felt like a team that had just had enough, and what an unleashing of 11 games of tension, and with all of the bad feelings swirling around the program, to be able to focus it and direct it at Tulsa. It's at least satisfying the way that FAU football ended its 2024 season. Welcome in to the podcast from the inside, the Florida Atlantic Inside Podcast, Florida Atlantic Voice, presented by Robes Law Group. I'm the voice of FAU, Ken LaVicka. Robes Law Group, presenting sponsor of the Florida Atlantic Voice. When life tackles you hard, call Robes Law Group, your campus accident attorneys, at 561-570-5700, or visit Robes, ROBES, robeslawgroup.com. Could you have possibly imagined the outcome going into the finale against Tulsa? Two teams just playing out the final four quarters, 60 more minutes of football, nothing to play for but personal pride. Two programs where, in all likelihood, very few of the players on that field are actually going to be putting on the same uniform at that institution, that respective institution. And FAU finding a way to make sure that they tighten things up. They went out, they played with pride, they played with speed, they played with dominance, with physicality, and FAU put 63 points on the board in a 63-16 triumph over Tulsa. Could you have ever imagined going in that would actually happen? I know it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things other than some better vibes around the program. But I, as somebody who has been ingrained within FAU football for the last 16 years, I can't tell you how proud I am of that collective, that group in that locker room, that they decided they weren't going to put their heads down and listlessly finish the year. That was a completely bullying performance yesterday, and it's something we've been waiting for all freaking season, and FAU delivered it. And at the very least, Florida Atlantic now goes into an offseason where you feel like, hey, there have been pieces here. All it's going to take is the right person to be able to unlock this thing and make sure that we see performances like that on a regular basis. Heck, I'll take semi-regular at this point. But again, in this day after edition of the Florida Atlantic Voice, we're discussing FAU's 63-16 blasting of Tulsa at H.A. Chapman Stadium there in Oklahoma. I think first and foremost, you've got to give so much credit for what we saw in this game against Tulsa to Chad Lunsford. Being an interim head coach is an unenviable task. It is rarely ever you auditioning for a job. And I don't think that Chad Lunsford's been auditioning for the head coaching job at FAU. I don't think he has been operating under the thought that he's going to get anything other than a passing look to take over the FAU football program. It's an uneasy time for a coach. It is an uncertain time for a coach. You never know how a roster full of players who you would expect to be a bit jaded by the process, a bit jaded by the system, perhaps a bit unmotivated. You never know how they're going to respond to you, especially coming after a loss in your interim debut at Florida Atlantic like Chad Lunsford and that team suffered. And to get this team ready to play in a meaningless final game of the season, meaningless from a standings perspective, meaningless from a achieve season goals perspective, and to have them prepared and to have them out there ready to send a message, that is an exemplary, top-notch, elite-level job by Chad Lunsford of tapping in to personal relationships, into his football acumen, into his ability to lead and making sure that a roster full of players who aren't sure of their future, who don't know what's coming up next week, let alone 6 months from now, he had them just out there flat out balling, playing for themselves, but also playing for each other. And it was awesome to see. And I know there's going to be, because we're in this pessimistic type of approach right now as FAU football fans, but really society as a whole. Oh, here's Ken just trying to put positive spin on crap. Listen, the season was bad. The season was in more instances than I'd like to admit pretty embarrassing. The season was a failure by any metric. But if you're an FAU fan and you can't find satisfaction and you can't find pride and you can't find the ability to realize and to offer a bit of a concession that Chad Lunsford did one hell of a job here to make sure this entire thing didn't fracture and completely fall apart after the dismissal of Tom Herman, then you're just a husk of a football soul. I mean, what superb work from Chad Lunsford and from that coaching staff as a whole. I mean, Brandon Harris, interim defensive coordinator for a game, and then puts his pride aside and says, yeah, Rock Bellantoni, come back, retake the defensive coordinator job. I want you as a part of this. I want you here for the final 2 games. We understand your role and your presence within this program is extremely important. And he stepped aside, and the FAU defense, after some rough moments against Charlotte, really cinched it up yesterday. And we're able to avoid the explosive plays that have plagued them so many times this year. It's sometimes in college football, it sometimes is the reality that a year doesn't go the way you want to. There are mass changes coming, and you've got to find the smallest of small positives to attach to at least snap you out of this cloud of failure, this air of disappointment, and make you say to yourself, you know what, there are better times ahead. And this was that for me. And I hope for many FAU fans, the amount of energy that this team came out onto the field with at Tulsa, there was no reason for these guys to go out there and play like that, to approach this game like that. I would have certainly understood. I think any of us would have certainly understood, hey, go through the motions, get into the portal, and prepare for your next stop or your next step of the football journey that you have upcoming. And instead, this is the part that touches me the most. They played unselfishly for one another. It wasn't solely, I got to go out there and put as much on tape as I possibly can so that other coaches at other programs or the new coaching staff can see what I can do. Me. No, this was true sacrifice. This was an interim head coach and a coaching staff. None of them know what the next couple of weeks are going to be like. Are they going to have jobs? What about their family? Are they going to have to uproot? Are they going to have to move their lives? They put that aside for one more week, and they all collectively came together and performed dazzlingly in a 63-16 win over Tulsa. First and foremost, I'm extremely, extremely proud of that. I don't think there's a ton of point in going drive by drive or looking at this game as a whole, because it ultimately doesn't mean much, because, again, you're trying to win game number 3 of the season. I think that looking at yesterday from a broad perspective, what it means is a little bit more productive than the game in and of itself. Just a couple of quick notes on the game, though. It was actually a historic game for FAU. Florida Atlantic, 42 points in the first half. No FAU team has ever scored that many points and a half in the history of the program. That's right, even more so than the 2017 offensive juggernaut FAU. This team, this Florida Atlantic team, 42 first-half points, best offensive half in the history of FAU football. 35 points in the second quarter. That is the best offensive quarter, or the best scoring quarter, because there was a defensive touchdown, Day Hill. Best scoring quarter in the history of Florida Atlantic football in quarter number 2. How wild is that? In a lost season, a season that has done nothing but trend downward, to finish it off with an explosion like that, who could have possibly imagined that would be the case? So a historic day for Florida Atlantic. Tyree Starks, 5 touchdown passes. That ties the single-game program record. The 63 points, second most in a single game in FAU history, just 6 behind when Florida Atlantic wrecked, dismantled, disintegrated North Texas regular season 2017, put 69 on the board. FAU was only 6 points off that. Just weird, right? Football sometimes is such a profoundly weird sport. I think it's important to note this, because there's been a lot of fretting and a lot of dire acknowledgement of the state of the program over the last week, upon several reports that several notable FAU players are headed to the transfer portal. Let me just frame it this way. Would it be less likely that FAU's quote-unquote impact players from this year would go to the portal if Florida Atlantic had a winning season? Yeah, common sense would dictate it would be less likely. But would it still be more than likely FAU's impact players from 2024 would head to the portal after the season if FAU had a winning record? That's also a yes. So it doesn't help that FAU had a really poor season. It definitely doesn't when it comes to player retention. But there is no guarantee that there was going to be strong player retention even if FAU had a championship caliber campaign. That is just the reality of college football, and that is the reality of the group of 5 when you bring in talented players. You've got to come to terms with it. Like, you're just going to have to. You're not going to be able to grow strong attachments to your favorite players, because there is never going to be, whether you have 10 wins or 1 win, there's never going to be any assurance that those players are going to come back the following year. Okay? But one more point on the transfer portal. Just because a player goes to the transfer portal doesn't mean that they're 100% going to leave the program. Plenty of players get into the portal and then leave the portal and come back to the program. All of the things Tom Herman talked about player retention and the collective and NIL, all of those things are still in place. Just because there's going to be a new head coach and there's going to be new leadership with the program doesn't change the same process of trying to retain the talent. You want to retain the right guys and then acquire additional talent to populate the roster and to complement one another and to then construct a championship caliber program. And in FAU's case, I think starting baby steps, a program that's at least going to get you 6 wins, guaranteed each regular season. Start there as a base and then build off of that. But just because a player's in the transfer portal doesn't mean you're not going to see them back in Boca. Is it possible that every player that goes to the portal goes elsewhere? Sure. But what I'm saying is that also could have been the case if FAU had 9-10 wins. So we're going to have to see how the portal plays out. But the process of player retention doesn't change because there's a new head coach coming in. And just because these FAU players are going to the portal doesn't mean that some of these FAU players aren't coming back to the roster. And what's going to happen is when the new head coach comes in, they're going to take inventory of what this FAU roster had in 2024, what still remains, what is in the portal, and figure out, hey, who do we want to make sure we can pluck back out of the portal and keep them here in Boca? How can we do this? What's the plan? Where can we get the collectives involved? NIL and Paradise. The process remains the exact same. Okay. I really, really have grown to enjoy seeing CJ Campbell play football at Florida Atlantic. I really, really find myself excited about the promise of Xavier Terrell out of the backfield at Florida Atlantic. I'm on record on this podcast talking about how much I love Amari Hayes, FAU wide receiver. CJ Hurd at safety. And Florida Atlantic just sort of an unlikely sequence of events that landed CJ Hurd at FAU. Hey, listen, all of them, it would be great if they came back to Florida Atlantic. I don't know if any of them are coming back to Florida Atlantic. I don't know if all of them are coming back to Florida Atlantic. What I do know is that there has been talent on this roster in 2024, and we saw the talent meld with a game plan, meld with a wonderfully called game offensively by Charlie Fry, with an excellently choreographed defensive showing from Rock Bellantoni, and it all came together yesterday, and it's something we've been waiting for all season long. I'd say better late than never. I don't want to do that here with 2024. Wish it would have happened way earlier. But it is satisfying to conclude the year like that. I was thinking about this when we were coming back from Tulsa late last night, and our flight landed in West Palm around 11 o'clock. I walked into my house around 12:30 or so after picking up the car at campus. It is, since 2019, it has been few and far between those happy plane rides. What we typically have experienced is getting on the charter. It's dour, it's dark, it's gloomy, it's frustrated. The air within that flying tube, it's heavy, and I forgot how much fun it is to be on a victory flight after an FAU road game. We've only really been able to experience that taking trips to Charlotte since Lane Kiffin left FAU. That was the one guaranteed road win that FAU is going to be able to get every single season. And so FAU going to Tulsa, where the last time, I remember all the way back in 2015 season opener, Charlie Partridge era, going there, having a 10-point lead in the third quarter, letting that thing slip away, and Tulsa won in overtime. I remember how dark and foreboding that flight was. But, yeah, it's much more enjoyable at 35,000 feet in that vacuum-sealed piece of fiberglass and some part steel, soaring home after a win, and especially a win like that, especially to conclude a season like that for FAU. It was a happy flight, and I think it was desperately needed for all involved. I want to give some superlatives, we'll call them, since this is me creating my own personal postseason awards for the very first time here on the Florida Atlantic Voice. The Kennies for outstanding FAU football excellence in 2024. We have 4 awards that we're going to give out. It's the MVP of FAU football 2024, Defensive Player of the Year, Offensive Player of the Year, and the Revelation of the Year with FAU football. Let's start with the Revelation of the Year for Florida Atlantic. And again, it's the Florida Atlantic Voice, the Inside Florida Atlantic podcast. I'm the voice of FAU, Ken LaVicka. The Kennies, the postseason FAU football awards in 2024. Florida Atlantic finishes the season with 3 wins on the year. A lost year for FAU. A new coaching staff is coming in, but there's no reason not to give out the Kennies that I just made up on the plane ride home what we're doing here on the Florida Atlantic Voice. I don't have the budget to create actual physical Kenny Awards, so it's going to have to be word of mouth congratulations to these FAU player recipients, and they're going to have to feel the pride of my words as opposed to having something tangible that they can put up on the mantle. The revelation of the year, the Kenny for revelation of the year with FAU football is Amari Hayes, FAU wide receiver, the sophomore out of Sarasota. 39 catches, 590 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He averaged this season 15.1 yards per reception. Amari Hayes, who was expected to contribute to an extent to Florida Atlantic in the receiving room, was really thrust into the primary receiver role after all the injuries that beset Florida Atlantic in fall camp and then early in the year. Jay-Sean Platt deciding that he was going to take a redshirt year, and Amari Hayes was sort of last man standing for a while when it comes to talent and health within that wide receiver room. A guy who is quote unquote ready to at least contribute or take on the number one mantle, if you believe in that sort of thing, with a wide receiver one. Just sort of a galactic confluence of events made him really the only true consistent target for Florida Atlantic much of the year when it comes to talking wide receivers. And Amari Hayes, the revelation of the year. When you're talking player retention, number 10 on offense, he's going to be one of the top targets for whoever the new head coach and whatever the staff looks like at Florida Atlantic when that decision is made, most likely in the next couple of days. Amari Hayes wins the Kenny for revelation of the year at Florida Atlantic, the award given to the player who showed massive growth and on-field value to the program that maybe wasn't anticipated going into the season. Boy, is that a long explanation of that award. But come on, contextually, you can figure it out. Now the Kenny for the defensive player of the year. The defensive player of the year for FAU. And I'm going to give that honor to Florida Atlantic safety Jaden Williams. Congratulations to Jaden Williams, the defensive player of the year at Florida Atlantic. And this was a tight race. This could have gone to any collection of FAU defensive players, but finishes the year with 25 tackles, 12 solo. He had 2 interceptions, both in the same game against UTSA. But I thought that Jaden Williams really did a good job of exhibiting his leadership, thrust into the prime role of organizing the defense, back end of the D at safety, has gone from corner to nickel to safety in 3 consecutive years. A lot of pressure put on him, a lot of trust put in him. I think throughout his career at Florida Atlantic, there was some question if he'd be able to take on mass amounts of responsibility. What was his future within the program going to be? And I think he's answered all those questions. And it is not common to go from corner to nickel to safety in 3 straight years. And the only way that you're able to pull that off is if the coaches, they feel as if they can place you in that role from not only an execution but a leadership perspective, and you've got to be very confident in your abilities and be versatile enough and open-minded enough to learn different ways in which to play separate positions, be able to take coaching to absorb the intricacies and how they differ from each of the different roles in which you've been placed, and then to thrive in those spots. And I think that Jaden Williams exemplified all of those traits, did them well, and that's why he's the defensive player of the year for FAU in 2024. And I think that the FAU defense looked significantly different when Jaden Williams was banged up, suffering injury. It didn't look as organized. It didn't look as potent, didn't look as stubborn. And I think that's a direct reflection of Jaden Williams being on the field or off the field. And we haven't seen Jaden Williams since that UTSA game where he played on a fractured foot and still had 2 interceptions and nearly had a pick 6. Jaden Williams, a tough guy as well, sacrificed for his football team, and that is why, to me, he is the defensive player of the year. He wins the Kenny for DPOY in 2024. Now, for the offensive player of the year at FAU. The offensive player of the year is going to go to Cam Fancher. Florida Atlantic starting quarterback, got injured at East Carolina, lost for the season due to a broken clavicle. And I think some people listening right now will say, Cam Fancher, with how uneven he was throughout the course of the season, shy of 1,600 yards passing, 6 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. He had a QBR of 35.3. Ken, I don't know if those are the greatest numbers. And no, they're not. They're not the greatest numbers, okay? And I have talked about many times, whether it's on the FAU football broadcasts or here on this podcast, I've talked about Cam Fancher's play and how it lacked consistency. We only really saw super explosive Cam Fancher against North Texas, especially in the first half. First half, Cam Fancher, UTSA, was phenomenal. But I think that Cam Fancher, coming into a new system with an offensive line that was an issue all year long, 4 new starters, and they never really found any sort of rhythm and never really truly were able to protect Cam Fancher. And then a receiver room that was obliterated due to injury from the start. And then the Ja'Shawn Platt decision to redshirt. The weapons that Cam Fancher thought he was going to be able to work with and the coaching staff thought that he was going to be able to use, have at his disposal, all of that was slashed really before the season even started. And it was never going to be a very tenable situation for Cam Fancher. It was very unlucky for Cam Fancher. Could Cam Fancher have been better this year for FAU? Sure. But you can discuss any player on the roster and probably make that case, right? That's what you do in a 3-9 campaign. And that's why you have issues and why you were 3-9 in a 3-9 campaign, because a lot of players could play, execute better. But I thought Cam Fancher, he didn't maximize what he had, but I think new quarterback, new system, new location, and then entirely new pieces compared to what he even had through most of camp in the fall. It's difficult for Cam. And what I respect most about Cam Fancher is that he didn't complain. He didn't pout. He didn't call anybody out. He hung in there with his teammates. He was unbelievably, undeniably tough. It took a broken clavicle to finally knock him out for the year. Think about how many hard hits this guy took this season. How many times he was ragdolled around. How many times he didn't really have any protection. And he had body after body striking him. Think about Michigan State just trying to make plays happen because nothing was open down the field. And could he have made better decisions sliding? Yeah. But he would pop right back up after taking helmet to the head, helmet to the ribs, helmet to the hip, the midsection. He would pop right back up. Can't tell you how many times he's limping around the field, and he's continuing to play the quarterback position. I have a ton of respect for Cam Fancher and what he, at the very least, attempted to do with what he had to work with, which a lot of times throughout the year was not an awful lot. Most of the issue being injury, especially to that receiver room. And so that's why I think Cam Fancher able to put up the numbers that he did. And think about it. How many games was FAU still in it in the fourth quarter because Cam Fancher was doing enough with a stagnant offense to help drag them into a situation to at least be dangerous, to be competitive, to be in games? Cam Fancher is the offensive player of the year for me. He wins the Kenny for offensive player of the year. Now the MVP award for Florida Atlantic. The Kenny in 2024 for MVP. And by the way, it's the Florida Atlantic Voice presented by Robes Law Group, ROBES, robeslawgroup.com. The MVP also on the offensive side of the ball. He is someone that there was a lot of talk about him after he transferred in to FAU. He got off to a slow start. He was not the number one option, in my opinion, at his position the first, month of the season. in 2024. But the MVP for Florida Atlantic is running back C.J. Campbell. He wins the Kenny Award for MVP of 2024 FAU football. Over 1,300 all-purpose yards. He finishes with 844 rushing yards, 466 receiving yards as well. He had 11 rushing touchdowns, 3 receiving touchdowns, and he was the FAU workhorse. Because of the lack of consistency with Cam Fancher and because of the thinness of the wide receiver room and because of the issues along the offensive front, a lot of pressure fell on the shoulders of the Florida Atlantic running backs. And C.J. Campbell was not the top back in that room in the first month. I think that was Zuberi Mobley. Mobley was the one who was a little bit more explosive. He was the one who was breaking tackles a little bit better. He was hitting holes a little bit harder and sooner, a better decision maker. But then as the year went on, and I think this is what really changed the trajectory for C.J. Campbell, is when Tom Herman and Charlie Fry made the conscious decision to make C.J. Campbell a massive weapon catching the football out of the backfield. That North Texas game, the first half of the North Texas game, is where I thought C.J. Campbell and his abilities, his true talents, were really exposed to the world. And I think him being so dangerous with his hands made him a much more dangerous ball carrier, if that makes any sense. Because so many defenses were having to focus in on where's C.J. Campbell in the passing game. Is he coming on a wheel route? Has he leaked into the middle of his own defense? As soon as you have to account for that, then it makes it easier for him to run the football. Because your linebackers are having to think about, do I have to cover number 5? Do I have to cover number 5? Am I going to have to get back in coverage? And as soon as there's that hesitation and there's that thought that has to happen, C.J. Campbell's getting a handoff and you're a step slow and suddenly there's a blocker right on you and 5 is coming at you and it's hard to bring him down. But C.J. Campbell, there's a reason that he's going to be sought after throughout the country in the transfer portal if he indeed officially heads there. But there's also a reason, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that C.J. Campbell is going to be a major subject of player retention for the new FAU coaching staff. It's because he's really, really, really freaking good. And he's tough. And he very easily could have said, hey, I'm not gonna play this finale. I got to think about 2025. And that guy was out there taking hits. That guy was out there running into the end zone. That guy was out there throwing blocks. I mean, on the Jabari Smith touchdown on the screen pass from Tyreek Starks, C.J. Campbell is 60 yards downfield throwing a crushing block on a linebacker at the 10-yard line. Like, that's the type of guy, that's the type of character you want in your locker room at any level of football, and especially college football. C.J. Campbell, the way he conducted himself, he's a superb, impressive, mature, hard-working, versatile, and really talented young man. And C.J. Campbell, he wins the Kenny for the MVP of Florida Atlantic football in 2024. Florida Atlantic Voice, Day After Edition, here on the Florida Atlantic Voice presented by Robes Law Group. I'm Ken LaVicka. I wanted to cover a couple of things before we wrap this up. This is our final Day After edition of the Florida Atlantic Voice here in 2024. I was asked by Bill if the UCF job coming open, Gus Malzahn, according to multiple reports, is headed to Florida State. In fact, it was multiple reports, but now it's official. Gus Malzahn's going to be the offensive coordinator at Florida State, leaving the UCF head coaching job, so that's now vacant. I was asked by Bill on social media at KLV Says if that's going to affect Brian White's FAU head coaching search. And Bill, it's a good question, and it crossed my mind, and I actually don't know the answer to that. I'm not trying to reduce the FAU football job. I would never do that. One, because, well, I love FAU, and I think that any coach who's worth their salt as a X's and O's, as a recruiter, as a college football mind should want to come to Florida Atlantic and build this thing into what we all think it can be. I don't know how much crossover there is between, let's be honest, an American Athletic Conference job that finished in the basement of the league and a Big 12 job. I don't know the answer to that. Is there a little bit of crossover depending on the name? Probably at some level of the coaching search in this Venn diagram, there's probably some crossover between a couple of the names that Terry Mahajer, former FAU Associate Athletic Director, now the AD at UCF, and Brian White, FAU Athletic Director, they're vetting and they're preparing to talk to. But I don't know if these two programs are close enough in the grand scheme of things in the landscape of college football to be focusing on the same target realistically for who they're eventually going to hire as the head coach. The FAU brain in me, and I don't know, maybe it's a little delusional, would say, there might be some competition now for a finalist for head coach between UCF and FAU. But the rational part of me says, I don't know. I'd be willing to bet at the top of the UCF likelihood of finalists and the top likelihood of FAU finalists. They're probably not the same, but maybe, who knows? Who knows? I trust Brian White's decision-making in these spots. I've told him as much, and I think he does a really, really, really good job and does his due diligence. So I wouldn't put it past Brian White to land somebody that UCF says, oh, man, we really wanted to have that person come coach here. But realistically, I don't know. Maybe. That's my cop-out answer to that question, Bill. Thank you for tweeting at me at KLV Says with the question. I got a tweet this week that actually bothered me a little bit. And I shouldn't be responding to just one singular person and taking it as a personal attack as if this is the majority opinion of me. But it struck a nerve, and I figured that I should take the opportunity to address it here on the podcast. FAU fans, I appreciate all of you, and I want you to always reach out to me. I love fielding your questions. I love having discourse and conversation with you about the state of FAU athletics, football, basketball. Hell, if you want to throw cross-country stuff at me, do it. Fine. Baseball, softball, who cares? Let's go. This is primarily a football and men's basketball podcast because those are the sports I call for Florida Atlantic, but I'll go anywhere. I've been at FAU for a very long time, and I'm well-versed enough we can talk about anything, okay, to your FAU heart's desire. This tweet from Twilly_tweets. One of my side jobs is just a Dolphins content creator with Sports Illustrated. Alan Poupart and I do a post-game Dolphins podcast, the All Dolphins podcast, and I, in the midst of what's been, just like FAU, a frustrating season for the Dolphins, I can be pretty critical of the Fins on this podcast, and I appreciate a lot of FAU fans also follow my other ventures as well, and that's where this comes in. At Twilly_tweets. Here's his tweet from November 24th, this last Sunday. You talk so hard towards the Fins, even off a huge win. This was after they beat the Raiders. But talk so nicely towards FAU. Please help me understand. Again, that at Twilly_tweets. First things first, just on its face. $1 million professional athletes and how they're discussed always should be, and with me always will be, discussed different, with a separate level of critical thought and critical analysis than 18 to 22-year-old teenagers transitioning to young men college football student athlete. Okay? Like, that's just common sense. That's just being fair and sensical in my mind. Oh, but Ken, NIL, I don't care. There's nobody at Florida Atlantic that is making 7-figure NIL money. As great as that would be, as game-changing as that would be, that is not the reality of Florida Atlantic in 2024. So from a money perspective, what I say about Tyreek Hill or Tua Tagovailoa or Liam Eichenberg or Zach Sealer or Javon Holland or Odell Beckham, that's always going to be different than what I say and the way that I analyze and convey my thoughts to the fans about Cam Fancher or CJ Campbell or Jaden Williams or Jackson Ambush or Jaden Wheeler. Simply finances dictate that that's a different approach that I take because I'm being a normal, functioning, and rational human being, okay? But outside of that, talking about 27, 28, 29, 30-year-old professional athletes, adults, grown men, okay, and how they do their job and being critical about them if they're lacking in their area of expertise is significantly different than bringing the hammer down on student athletes who some of them just got their driver's license a year and a half before they took to the field at Florida Atlantic to play Division I college football. I am inherently going to have a more critical nature of the way that I evaluate a 28-year-old professional athlete as opposed to an 18 or a 19-year-old college football player. Again, that's common sense. That should resonate with the common sense part of your brain. And I don't know if that's the frontal cortex. I don't know if that is the left or right hemisphere of your brain. I don't know. I don't know where that lies. That's a different question for somewhere else. But if that doesn't trigger wherever that component of your brain is, to understand that maybe, just maybe, that is the difference between analysis of the Dolphins and analysis of FAU, then I don't know what to tell you. And another point off of this as well. I am the play-by-play voice of Florida Atlantic. I am a representative of Florida Atlantic. I am a spokesperson for Florida Atlantic. Okay? It is not in my best interest, nor is it in Florida Atlantic's best interest, nor is it in the student athlete's best interest, nor is it in the families of the student athlete's best interest, nor is it in the coaching staff's best interest, nor is it in the family of the coaching staff's best interest for me to be sledgehammering Florida Atlantic, especially in seasons when expectations have not been met. I would never, ever, ever eviscerate a student athlete beyond a reasonable amount, or a coach, or a coaching staff, or an administrator, or anybody within the institution. One, because I value my career. Two, because I value personal relationships. But three, because I value fairness when it comes to hierarchy of competitive athlete as well. Okay? I have personal relationships with the Miami Dolphins. And you know what? They understand that me saying critical things of them, professionals, is part of the gig. Okay? But I'm also not media. I'm media when it comes to the Dolphins. I am not media when it comes to FAU. And it bothers me when people consider me a member of the media with Florida Atlantic. I don't cover FAU. I'm not doing anything journalistically. The only time I would do anything journalistically at Florida Atlantic is if I'm correcting something that was reported on the outside that was incorrect, and I'm providing clarification. That would be the only journalism I would do, okay? I'm not going to announce 2 days before a game who the starting quarterback is for FAU if there's any question beforehand. I'm not leaking anything. I'm not checking in with sources to, before something is done, make sure the masses know what's going to take place. I am not FAU media. I am not in a journalistic platform with Florida Atlantic. Okay? So therefore, my level of criticism as a representative of FAU towards what I'm seeing with Florida Atlantic is going to be different than the Dolphins. But another extension to this point, I have worked very hard to acquire the equity at Florida Atlantic from the highest parts of the institution, the most elevated roles within the institution. I have worked very hard to gain the equity for me to be able to present to the FAU fan in the most blunt way I can what I'm seeing with Florida Atlantic. Okay? I am one of the more critical play-by-play voices, I think, of any institution in the country, no matter the conference, no matter the level of college football. And it's because I've earned that respect that I can deliver verbal picture in a critical manner that is not going to disrespect the subject or the institution. I'm not going to BS the listener or BS the FAU fan. If Florida Atlantic is miserable in the running game against Tulsa or Tulane or Memphis, I'm going to convey that on the game broadcast. Want to know why? Because I've been here for a long time, and the people, the higher-ups at FAU, trust in me and in my approach to not putting blinders on the eyes of the FAU fan. Okay? I'm not going to pump you full of false positivity, but I'm also not going to bury you in negativity. And there's a line to toe with that. And I don't mean to talk myself up, and I don't mean to sound arrogant, but I do that as well as anybody, towing that line. But I'm not going to bury FAU student athletes. Listen to any other play-by-play voice in the country, and I promise you, when things aren't going well, you're going to hear an awful lot more fluff from them than you will from me. So if you think I'm not critical enough at Florida Atlantic, use your brain. Use your brain as to why that might be that I'm not as critical about FAU student athletes and poor performances as I am the Miami freaking Dolphins, okay? But also understand, you don't know how upfront and in your face and truthful you have it from me when things aren't going to plan at Florida Atlantic. You have to ask yourself, would you rather me be a false ray of sunshine presenting puppies and rainbows to you in the midst of a 3-9 season where you've lost 6 straight, you haven't won a conference game going back to last year? Would you rather me just be feeding you propaganda, or to the extent I possibly can, telling you the truth about what I'm seeing and what's being done on the field at Florida Atlantic, okay? So just because I'm not as critical of FAU, of 18 to 22-year-olds, 23, 24, depending on what year they're at, than I am the Miami Dolphins, doesn't mean that I'm not telling you the truth. And again, put me up against anyone else, you've got it good. FAU fans, I don't want to be a jerk about this or sound like I'm gassing myself up, but you've got it really good. And I've said it on this podcast before. I don't say anything on here that I would not say or have not said on the Florida Atlantic Sports Network. Okay? And very rarely am I questioned about anything said on those broadcasts or on here. Want to know why? Because I've gained the equity to be the fair and truthful voice of FAU, both good and bad. I'm going to make sure you know it's really, really good when it's really, really good. And I'm going to make sure you know it is not good when it's not good. Okay? I just wanted to clarify that. Like, don't tell me that I'm not, like, to me, when you say that I'm not critical enough of FAU, that leads me to think that you believe I'm feeding you feel-good propaganda, and that has never been the case from day one with me at FAU. Even as a youngster, and I was young when I took over this FAU job, I was given leeway because I was trusted, because I'm a professional. Now at age 40, where I'm one of the longest tenured voices in all of college athletics, I've been at FAU for damn near 20 years. No. Do not tell me that I'm not critical enough of FAU when I have not once minced words to the extent that everybody in the FAU universe is comfortable with about what I'm seeing. I don't BS you and never would. I wanted to make sure we covered that. Florida Atlantic Voice presented by Robes Law Group, ROBES, robeslawgroup.com, ROBES, robeslawgroup.com, the presenting sponsor of the Florida Atlantic Voice. Got sidelined by an accident? Robes Law Group, your campus accident attorneys. They're going to help you score the compensation you deserve. Reach out at 561-570-5700 or robeslawgroup.com, ROBES, robeslawgroup.com. All right, so moving forward, it's going to be a lot of men's basketball. FAU at the time of recording 4-5. I know there's hand wringing, there's concern. A second buzzer-beating loss at home to Florida Gulf Coast. I understand that there's some worry. We're going to talk about it. Damon Arnett's going to jump on with me. It'll be an early week edition of the Florida Atlantic Voice presented by Robes Law Group. We're going to talk about some of the highs of the season and some of the lows of the season, why FAU is sub 500, and FAU will be at FIU on Wednesday. I'll have the call with Damon on the Florida Atlantic Sports Network. Want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast. Subscribe to it wherever you get your podcast. Tell your friends. Let's get the subscriptions up. It's free. Let's make sure that this is the #1 FAU podcast. This is the Inside Florida Atlantic podcast, the Florida Atlantic Voice. Thanks for listening, and it's going to be busy. I think the next couple of days you're going to be meeting a new FAU head football coach. Again, just my gut feel with that. Brian White is busy trying to find the next leader of the FAU football program. We'll have an emergency edition of that as well when the announcement is made. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time. This has been the Florida Atlantic Voice presented by Robes Law Group. Bye-bye.